3 weeks ago, I almost lost my left leg. Not to the infection itself, but to silence the kind that comes from people who should care and simply don't. I was lying in a hospital bed at Denver Mercy Medical Center, staring at the red streak crawling up my calf like a fuse. The doctors said I had 48 hours before the bacteria reached my bloodstream. I needed emergency surgery that cost $12,000, and my insurance gap would only cover a fraction of it. I called my mother first. She answered over the hum of a blow dryer and said she couldn't talk long. She was at her office getting ready for a showing. I explained what the doctors told me, that I might lose my leg if I didn't schedule surgery within 2 days. She paused long enough for me to think she was crying. But when she spoke, her voice was dry and polite. "Tessa, you always find yourself in some crisis. Maybe this will teach you to plan better." I told her this wasn't a lesson. It was medicine. She sighed and said she would ask my father, though she doubted he'd say yes. Because, in her words, we can't keep rewarding irresponsibility. When my father picked up, I was ready to beg. He sounded cheerful, like nothing was wrong. "Your mother told me you called. Big news here, we just bought a yacht." I tried to interrupt, but he kept going, describing the deck space and the teakwood table as if we were talking about weather. "A yacht," I said finally. "For $52,000. He laughed softly. 52 and worth every penny. It's a wedding gift for your sister. A proper family investment. You'll understand someday." I told him the hospital wouldn't operate without a deposit. He said, "Then find a way. You're an adult now." The line went dead. The beeping from my IV filled the room like a metronome counting down to amputation. I had 48 hours. Less than half the money. And parents who thought a boat was a better investment than my leg. I remember staring at the ceiling, tasting metal in my mouth, realizing this was the exact moment adulthood stopped being a promise and became survival. That night, the hallway outside my room was quiet, except for the hum of machines. I was half asleep when I heard a voice I hadn't heard in months say my name. My grandmother, Irene Whitaker, stood at the edge of the bed holding a small envelope in both hands. I whispered that she shouldn't have come, but she smiled and said she'd already sold her car last year. So what was one more trip to see her granddaughter who'd forgotten how to ask for help? She placed the envelope in my palm before I could protest. $900, she said softly. "It's all I could get for Harold's paints and brushes." My throat closed as I told her she couldn't sell Grandpa's art set, that it was the last thing she had of him. She shook her head, her voice steady. "He'd want me to use what's left of his life to keep yours going. He always said love has to cost something, or it isn't real." I tried to give it back, saying the money wouldn't be enough to change anything. She looked at me like I'd missed the point. "Then let it remind you that someone still believes you're worth saving." For a long time, neither of us spoke. I stared at her hands, the same hands that once guided mine when I was learning to write my name. She told me she'd heard about my father's yacht and that she hoped it didn't sink. Because if it did, he might finally understand what it feels like to lose something you can't replace. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I did both. When she left, the envelope lay on the table like proof that love didn't vanish with disappointment. It simply found quieter ways to survive. By the next morning, the envelope was still where Irene had left it, a small white corner catching the light like an accusation. I hadn't told anyone at the hospital what she'd done, but word had a way of moving without permission. When Dana stopped by my room between shifts, she looked at the envelope, then at me, and asked if it was true that my grandmother sold her husband's art supplies. I nodded, and she shook her head, whispering, "That's the most selfless thing I've ever heard." I told her it wasn't enough to cover the surgery, and she said, "Maybe not alone, but people will help." They always do when something feels real. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from her. You should check your email. Someone started a campaign for you. I opened it to find a page titled, Help Nurse Tessa Keep Her Leg. The description said, She spends her life saving others. Let's help her save herself. I called Dana, my voice unsteady, asking why she did it. She said she hadn't, someone else had. Probably another nurse who'd heard the story. Don't be mad, she added. It's already spreading. I told her I wasn't mad. Just confused. She laughed. Good. Because your link's already on every staff board in the building. By nightfall, my phone filled with notifications, donations, messages, names I didn't recognize. Someone wrote, My mother's alive because of you. It's our turn. Another left a note, for Irene, who reminds us what love looks like. The hospital administrator came by with cautious optimism, saying they'd received confirmation of incoming funds and could move forward once a minimum deposit cleared. I stared at the balance line, 6,200 and climbing. By morning, it was 9,400. By noon, enough to schedule the surgery. I hadn't asked anyone to fight for me, but somehow they did. The rumor that started in one hospital hallway had turned into a lifeline, passed from stranger to stranger until it reached me again. Wrapped in proof that kindness could travel faster than shame, the art hall smelled faintly of varnish and new paint when I wheeled my grandmother through the doorway. She thought it was a quiet lunch to celebrate her recovery. But the lights, flowers, and crowd of familiar faces told her otherwise. You planned this, she whispered. And I told her it was the community's idea. Not mine. She smiled, still unaware that this afternoon would expose more than gratitude. When the director took the stage, he said, We're gathered to honor Irene Whitaker, who sold her late husband's art tools to save her granddaughter's leg. The room stilled, and every head turned toward us. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother, Patricia, standing near the back, her arms folded, face pale beneath the makeup. My father, Gregory, looked like he'd swallowed his tongue, while Caroline leaned close to him, whispering something sharp. Patricia's voice cut across the silence. This is inappropriate. Family matters shouldn't be turned into charity theater. The director hesitated, but my grandmother's hand found mine. Sit down, Patricia, she said quietly, and the crowd murmured. My father straightened, his voice steady but tight. We appreciate the gesture, but this is not how our family does things. I turned to him and asked, How does our family do things? Dad, by buying yachts instead of helping? The air between us thinned. Gregory's jaw clenched as he said, I worked for everything I have. Tessa, you could have done the same instead of expecting handouts. I told him I never asked for anything, only for them to care enough to answer the phone. Caroline laughed under her breath and muttered, You always make everything about you. My grandmother turned to her, eyes sharp. And you've never learned the difference between compassion and convenience. Patricia snapped. Mother, stop embarrassing yourself. My grandmother rose slowly, her voice firmer than I'd heard in years. No, Patricia, you embarrassed yourself when you let strangers do what family wouldn't. The crowd was silent again, every word hanging in the air like a verdict. I stood because I couldn't stay quiet any longer. I'm not here to humiliate anyone, I said, but I won't pretend anymore. I begged for help, and you said a limp might teach me responsibility. Gregory started to speak, but I cut him off. You told me a boat was an investment, and I was a sunk cost. My voice didn't shake. That yacht won't carry you past this moment. Dad, you made your choice, and now everyone sees it. My grandmother reached for the wooden box someone brought to the front, the art set. Restored. Returned by the community. She touched it with trembling fingers and whispered, "Harold would have been proud." Patricia turned away, clutching her purse. But no one moved to follow. The applause began softly, then grew until it filled the hall. It wasn't celebration, it was acknowledgement. They saw what love looked like when money wasn't enough to buy silence. The fallout began quietly. The way cracks appear before a wall gives way. 2 weeks after the art hall confrontation, Caroline called, her voice brittle. "The wedding's been postponed," she said. And when I asked why, she muttered, "Jason's family wants to take some time. They think things need to settle." I didn't say a word. Just listened as she tried to fill the silence with excuses. "It's not because of you," she added quickly. "It's the gossip. The way people keep bringing up that yacht. They say Dad's priorities look bad." I told her it wasn't gossip if it was true. She hung up without saying goodbye. The next call came from Gregory. "Your mother's upset," he said, his tone more tired than angry. "This whole thing at the gallery has damaged our reputation. Clients are asking questions." I asked if he'd thought about how it damaged me. He exhaled sharply and said, "You've made your point. I hope you're proud." I told him pride had nothing to do with it. That he'd built his own stage and invited everyone to watch him fall. He didn't respond. Just muttered that the yacht was going on the market and that maybe selling it would make things right. I said it wouldn't. And he said, "You'll see that time fixes more than you think." I told him, time doesn't fix anything when people refuse to change. A week later, Patricia showed up at my apartment unannounced. She didn't come inside. "We need to talk," she said, her hands tight around her purse. "Your father and I can't move forward while this story keeps spreading. It's getting cruel." I asked what she wanted me to do about it. She looked past me, like she couldn't stand to meet my eyes. "Maybe you could tell people there were misunderstandings. That we offered to help, but you refused." I stared at her and asked if she believed that herself. She hesitated, then whispered, "It doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what people think." I told her that was the difference between us. I was done managing appearances. She left without another word. When I told Irene later, she listened quietly and said, "Patricia always cared more about saving face than saving hearts." She signed new documents that same week, updating her will and dividing everything between Uncle David and me. "Your mother will get something too," she said, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "A letter explaining why?" I didn't ask what it said. Some consequences are better left unopened. The days that followed felt quieter. Not peaceful yet, but steady in a way I hadn't known before. Irene and I spent most afternoons in her garden. And one evening, as we cleaned the old paintbrushes she'd managed to buy back, she asked, "Do you regret saying everything you did that night?" I told her no. That the only thing I regretted was staying silent for so long. She nodded and said, "Silence is just another way to lie when it protects the wrong people." I looked at her, the sunset washing her face in gold, and said I wasn't trying to punish anyone, only to stop being punished by them. A few days later, Caroline called. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "Tessa," she began, "I need to apologize." I waited, unsure what apology could mean after all this time. She said she and Jason were in therapy, that it was his idea, but she'd stayed because she needed to. The therapist asked me to describe our family, and I realized I didn't know how without sounding cruel. "You were right about us," she said. I told her I wasn't looking to be right, only to survive. She laughed softly, then broke down mid-sentence. "I laughed when you said you might lose your leg. I still hate myself for that. I didn't say she should. I just asked if she was trying to change." I am, she said. For real this time. I told her that was enough for now. And for the first time, she didn't argue. That night, I told Irene about the call. She smiled faintly and said, "People can change when they lose their audience." I said maybe Caroline was finally learning that love doesn't have to perform. Irene touched my arm and said, "Neither do you." The truth of it settled in slowly. I realized then that boundaries aren't walls built out of anger. They're doors you close to keep the light from going out. I hadn't taken revenge on my family. I'd simply chosen not to hand them the matches anymore. And in that choice, the noise faded, replaced by something like breathing steady, real, and mine. The hospital smelled like bleach and rain that morning, and I realized it had been exactly 6 months since the surgery. A woman stopped me in the hallway, her eyes red, her voice cracking as she asked if I was the nurse who'd nearly lost her leg. When I said yes, she told me her mother had cut her off for asking for help with her son's medical bills. She said it would build character, the woman whispered, half laughing, half crying. I told her I understood more than she thought. She asked how I made peace with it. And I said, I stopped waiting for them to be who I needed and found people who already were. She looked at me for a long moment and nodded like she was memorizing the words. Later, as I finished my shift, I saw the reflection of my scar in a metal cabinet, faint now, but still there. A thin silver thread that didn't hurt anymore. That night, I drove home to Irene's house, where the porch light was always on. She was reading in her chair when I came in and asked how my day was. I told her it was heavy but good. And she smiled, saying, "Good is enough." I sat beside her, the quiet between us steady as breath. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a burden or a survivor. I just felt whole. And that was enough. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had to choose peace over approval, I hope you know that choice doesn't make you cold, it makes you free. Share this with someone who's still learning that love and loyalty aren't the same thing. And if it reached you, stay a while, because sometimes the quietest stories carry the loudest truth.